So much for being here, and thank you to the hero that called out the focus here. I think we missed an opportunity to get like sponsorship from Concord Eye Associates or something, because I was sitting there thinking there might be a problem. I love the Irish music to start off the evening. You know, I have a nice Irish last name. I sort of felt like I should dance out here and do a jig, but I'm going to share with you a little secret about my last name. It's spelled kind of funny, Oneail. There's no apostrophe. It's O-N-E-A-I-L. My husband really impressed me on our first date. He said his ancestors were very wealthy and could afford to buy all the vowels. So, no Laurel and Hardy, but we get the next best thing tonight. All right, so tonight we have such a treat. We're going to be looking at modern architecture in New England to start off. For about the first 45 minutes or so, we'll take a break and then we'll reconvene and look at the work of none other than Georgia O'Keeffe. So a nice healthy dose of modernism. And so for tonight's first section, we will be zipping through a couple of New England states. I'm gonna save you some gas, whet your appetite with some beautiful images. But that being said, I hope this program inspires a few road trips this summer, because most of these buildings will be or are accessible to the public. So the title here, Revolutionary Design, Modern Architecture in New England. Most of the time when we think about anything revolutionary in New England, we are thinking about the 18th century, right? Good old saltbox colonial or something like that. When it comes to architecture, I think most people think of New England as being fairly traditional. This is John Adams' birthplace. This is a federal style house over at Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth. But what we have here in New England are really some outstanding examples of modern architecture that come to us by way of leading architects in, not just in this country, but in the world. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend these 45 minutes together. I'm gonna have to start talking a little bit faster, I think. We're going to get started with Walter Gropius, turn our attention to Philip Johnson, and then to Frank Lloyd Wright. Those are all examples of domestic architecture. It's really fun to look at them because the entire time you can think, could I live in a house like this? During intermission, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then we have two academic libraries, one by Louis Kahn and one by Maya Lin. The image on the screen here is just a little snapshot of one of the houses that we will see along the way, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright's Zimmerman House. Okay, so let's just dive right in. Let me introduce you to Walter Gropius, who you see on the screen here. He's a German-American architect, best known for founding the school of art and design called the Bauhaus back in Germany in 1926. And it was really kind of a revolutionary school, and in particular in terms of design, it was a huge shift away from the aesthetics of the Victorian era. So you think of a nice Victorian house with all of this ornamentation and decoration, and Walter Gropius here was like, let's make everything streamlined. Let's use flat surfaces. Let's use a lot of industrial materials, like things that are readily available, commercially available. Let's use glass, let's use steel, and let's strip things down to their most simple elements. So that was really what he was best known for, but here he was living in Germany, right around the time of the start of the Third Reich. And as you might know, Hitler was not a fan of anything modern. So Gropius quickly left the country and eventually found his way to America, where he was invited to teach at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Now he came to America, sorry about this, he came to America with all of this very modern furniture that had been produced at the Bauhaus. And people sort of started to feel bad for him. So in fact, none other than Helen Storrow gifted him 4 acres of property in Lincoln, Massachusetts, for him to build a modern style house that would be a great expression of his architectural ideas. So what we see here is his home, built in 1938. It's 3 beds, 3 bathrooms, and 2,300 square feet of space. I always feel like a realtor when I get into that mode. It's about a mile from Walden Pond. It's about 15 miles from Harvard Square. but not since shots rang out in nearby Concord, Massachusetts, had anything so revolutionary happen in the Boston area. This is an emphatically modern house, and you can imagine the neighbors weren't thrilled with it. For some reason, they kept referring to it as a chicken coop, but what we will see is that Gropius did his best to try and integrate this house into its surroundings. So here's just a slightly different view. I'm seeing maybe if I move a little bit, maybe some of that feedback can go back. So here's a slightly different view. We can see that there's a fieldstone basement here, and we can also see that he is, well, it's difficult to see, but he is using clapboard siding. He's just using it vertically. He also has a brick chimney, which you can't see from this angle, but he is thinking about New England traditions as he's building this house. In every other way, though, it is a revolution. So he's bringing a lot of those Bauhaus principles here. So we have ribbon windows, we have a flat roof. All of his neighbors were certain that that roof was going to collapse for the first snowstorm. And what we see here is also something that's somewhat of a New England tradition. We see this projecting porch. And I love the idea of this porch. Imagine this is your house. You're driving up the driveway. You're coming home during a rainstorm or a snowstorm, and this porch is like running out to meet you at the driveway to offer you a little bit of protection. It's coming out away from the house at a diagonal, pretty unusual for domestic architecture, but it works. And then you get to like this screen of these glass bricks here, and it provides a little bit of protection. Now we can see from this image that there's the front door over here, but there's another way to access the house, and that is up this spiral staircase, which curls up to the second floor here. Not quite as welcoming, but that's out front, and we'll kind of finish up at that point too. Once you go inside Gropius's house, oh, I should mention too, when the house was finished in 1938, it was a big deal. This house was featured in the New York Times, and thousands of people kind of marched through the house in the first few years after it was built. Apparently, one elderly lady kind of came to visit, looked around, and said to Mrs. Gropius something to the effect of, "Isn't it exhausting to always be living in the future?" But what you'll see is that the house is very functional. There's a lot about it to love. So once you come through the front door, the handle of it is just over here. You are inside this little portico, which is illuminated, again, by the outside light coming through those glass bricks. This space can be kind of separated out by these curtains that you can draw. They are the same color as the exterior of the house, but kind of give it a farmhouse aesthetic. Again, sort of a nod to the neighbors here. And then there's even like a little inset rug here, so you don't have any problems tripping over rugs, and you come in on this cork floor. There's more vertical clapboard siding on the interior of the house, a pretty unusual choice. There's an open closet over here with metal piping, again, sort of commercial industrial materials. And he's certainly telling you not to cram too much stuff in that closet because everybody's going to see it. There's other things like this wall sconce here and the metal pipes that sort of line the edge of the staircase to the second floor. These are all commercially available elements that no one would have thought to have put in their house prior to this moment. Now, the one really custom element here is this unusual handrail that he has designed and installed in his house. I love that it has this kind of snake-like curve to it as you go up the stairs. So we can't see every room at the Gropius house, but I would love to share with you the dining room, some of the more public spaces, because this is at the back of the house. We can see that there are more glass bricks on the interior. Imagine having your closest friends over. That's really all you can accommodate in a tiny dining room like this. There is this focused light in the ceiling, which creates this cone that just goes right around the table, only illuminates you and your guests. So there's a wonderful intimacy there. There's more built-in curtains here too. So you can draw the curtains and feel like you're in this very special, warm, cozy place with just your friends. Having said that, there is a huge plate glass window here too, so there's this connection and extension outside. You're not going to feel claustrophobic in this cozy space, but it shows just how thoughtful he was in designing these spaces that he was going to use and really live in. Now, if you were to walk through those curtains, that would bring you into his living room. And this is really where you can see how the siting of the house really works, because for his living room, he maximized passive solar heat. So during the winter, the sun is low in the sky, and it just bathes this room with light and warmth, and you could just relax on this pressed plywood chair here. This was something really special from the Bauhaus at the time. You can get something exactly like it from IKEA these days, of course. This is just another view of that same room, and you can see there is a wall of bookshelves. These fittings that were used to hang the bookshelves, again, this was kind of a commercial application. Most people for their homes would buy a nice piece of furniture, a bookshelf, but he has so many, and there are so many books, and these particular style of shelves are pretty flexible. You can move them around as needed. I love the little Bauhaus design reading couch here, so a place to lounge even right there in your living room. I'm going to bring you upstairs now. The kitchen is not anything to write home about, but the master bedroom is a pretty unusual space. It actually has a wall right down the center of the room. The bed is on one side, and then on the other side of that wall, we can see sort of like a little dressing area. There's a plexiglass window, so that when you're in this dressing area, you can see the bed, and there's a window that's built into that plexiglass. So what is this all about? Why all this division? Well, the Gropiuses love to sleep with their windows open, and this was a very smart way to keep that part of their house very cold. But of course, when you want to get ready or have to run out to the bathroom, you want a warmer space there. They were even more thoughtful and more generous with their daughter's room. They had a 12-year-old daughter when they were building the house, and she had a long list of wants for what she desired in her own bedroom. She actually got the biggest room in the house, which I think is very generous on the part of Gropius. This is a little reading area. Essentially where you would be standing in this photograph is her bed is right here. There's a door to outside here. And then just around the corner is this little nook here, where there's like a separate reading area or a bed for a guest, a little space to get ready, and again, another built-in curtain to provide that extra layer of privacy that you know every 12-year-old girl would just love for their own rooms. Now, one of the, when I say that she had crazy requests for her bedroom, she was dreaming big. She's like, I want sand on the floor, I want to be able to see the stars when I go to sleep at night, and he couldn't deliver on that, but he did give her own veranda on the second floor, this beautiful space here. This is Mrs. Gropius enjoying it. And at the top, or I should say this doorway here, is the top of where that spiral staircase ends at the front of the house. So there's that front view too. And when we think about the impact of this house, it can't be overstated. In fact, one of his colleagues from the Bauhaus moved in next door, built his own modernist house, and then all of a sudden, Lincoln became this mecca for modernist architecture. And if this is your vibe, you can go and explore it. They hold public events all the time. They're called the Friends of Modern Architecture Lincoln. You can find them online, and you can go and explore people's houses, which is always kind of fun. Now, the Gropius house was acquired by what is now Historic New England back in 1984, so it has been a museum house for quite some time, and you can visit it seasonally. It is well worth the drive. Lots of fun there. So Gropius had a huge impact on architecture, and the next architect we're going to be looking at is actually one of his students. His name's Philip Johnson. We can see him here with an example of his architecture, which many of you have probably experienced in real life. That is his modern addition to the main library in downtown Boston. You can probably recognize the Hancock Tower just behind it. So he was given this task of essentially doubling the size of the library, which was designed, a century earlier, and he had to kind of build something that was distinct but related, and we can see his solution here. Incidentally, he studied architecture under Gropius with I.M. Pei, who designed the Hancock Tower, just looming there behind. So Philip Johnson came to architecture with a really different purpose. It wasn't that he was so galvanized by the Bauhaus style. For him, architecture was really more about art. He was interested in form, he was interested in design, and so I think the most wonderful example of his work for us to look at is the house that he designed for himself, known as the Glass House, in 1949. And this is in New Canaan, Connecticut. So when it comes to the Glass House, to a certain extent, what you see is what you get. This is about 1,800 square feet. There's one bathroom, there's one bedroom here, and you can see just about all of it. Now, I mentioned he designed this for himself. He did say he was his own best client, and he did actually live here off and on. Definitely discovered some of the challenges of living in a glass house. So this house was kind of the beginning of his architectural experiments on this property. Eventually, he acquires 49 acres, and he builds all of these little outbuildings, 14 structures in total over the course of nearly 50 years. So he said that the idea for this house grew out of an experience that he had as a soldier during World War II. He was traveling through Poland and he saw all of these burned down houses, and he thought about what were the essential elements of a house. So he gives that to us here. He takes away the walls, he invites us to look inside, and he just uses the steel and the glass to give us sort of the outline, the shape of a house. If we go inside, and there is a door on axis on every wall of the house. You go inside. Here is the living room. This is actually some Bauhaus furniture for you here. What really makes the glass house spectacular is its connection to nature. In the glass house, nature is your wallpaper, and Philip Johnson joked that he had very expensive wallpaper. So we just a sort of slightly different view here. What's interesting to me about the glass house is that it's all about looking out, it's about framing these views, it's about feeling integrated into the landscape, but there's also this duality there. You feel like you're inside and outside at the same time, you're a part of and yet apart from the landscape. This is a house that aims at becoming invisible once you are inside of it. So we're going to just sort of zoom through this house very quickly. Just behind this little living room here is his dining room. So there's the living room, there's the dining room, it's just in this corner. And I think that a glass house is a perfect solution to, I don't know if any of you have this issue. At my house, there's one great chair, one great seat in my dining room where I can see everything. But here in his glass house, every seat is great. You get to see everything from every chair there. I don't know how much cooking he did at the glass house because this is the kitchen. It's a tiny little sink, it's a tiny little stove, and it's all integrated into this L-shaped counter. And when I say integrated, like the counter actually folds over and hides those functional elements. This is not a house where you come home with your playbill from a show and leave it on the counter. Everything is meant to be pristine and clean and nice clean lines there as well. Now the other main star of the show here is that giant fireplace. That wasn't the only means of heating the house. It does have radiant floors, and there was a radiant ceiling too, but I believe the radiant ceiling failed after some time. So he does have a pretty traditional giant fireplace here. It's outsized, right? It's actually the only place where you can get some privacy, because if you go around the other side, that is where the bathroom is. It's just inside that sort of silo structure of the fireplace, and it's a very sort of minimalist bathroom here with like just this little hanging circle for your shower curtain and just a little circle on the floor to provide a lip so that that water doesn't run all over the place, covered in this beautiful green tile. So if you're sleeping at the glass house. You get a little bit of privacy from the living room. There is this bank of closet space here and a little study just beyond it. But, you know, if you're sleeping there, you wake up with the sun. There are no curtains at the glass house, which actually brings up a bigger issue. If you're sleeping there, well, if you have guests, where do they sleep? And Philip Johnson came up with a solution for this. He came up with the idea of a guest house for the glass house. And get this, it has no windows, and you can't see into his house. It's a solid brick structure, or at least that's the way it looks. It's just across the lawn. He doesn't even want his guests looking at him. But on the other side of the guest house, there are these 3 large windows here. And you can probably just make out in this historic photo that Philip Johnson eventually did have to add a few curtains to his property. Now, like I said, there's like 14 other buildings on this expansive property. I'm going to show you just one other one because you can see that these are little follies. They're like miniature-sized buildings. They were experiments. This was the last one, which he called Da Monsta, and it's made out of modified gunite, so it's sort of like how you make a pool. And it reminds me very much of like Frank Gehry architecture. This was the most disorienting building I have ever stepped in. It made me physically ill because there are no 90-degree corners. All of the walls are sort of slanting to different angles, coming in at acute angles. It's so unsettling. And what's amazing is that Philip Johnson had always imagined that after he passed away, his property would open to the public, and he thought this would make a great visitor center. Fortunately, I think it would have made everybody sick. So fortunately, they sited their visitor center in downtown New Canaan, and you take a little bus to go see the house. So in the end, this is a structure that prompts us to consider some of the most fundamental questions about architecture and how we live. I think it also has a fascinating relationship to, I would say, reality TV. There's this notion of like living your life very publicly and letting other people watch, although he didn't necessarily like the idea of other people watching. That's why he didn't live there full time. But a little bit of exhibitionism, a little bit of surveillance, it's all wrapped into the glass house. So our next location, our last house that we're looking at, is much closer. And the architect here, of course, is none other than Frank Lloyd Wright, America's most famous, probably most popular architect. And this beautiful house on top of the waterfall is probably his most famous house. Falling Water was designed in the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And it was a design that he said he shook out of his sleeve. It was just a remarkable innovation of putting somebody's little vacation cabin, making it into a grand mansion, and siting it above this waterfall so that they could live with the sound and walk down a little staircase here and dip their toes in the water while they're having coffee in the morning. So Wright's designs, I think, still today look strikingly modern. But while he was figuring out the solution of Falling Water, he had another pressing issue in his career. It was the Great Depression, and there weren't a lot of rich clients looking for major vacation houses like this. So he came up with the idea of a small, affordable house for working class Americans. He was a rich man's architect until this moment. He called these affordable houses Usonian houses, which is supposed to stand for like United States of North America. But Usonian sort of sounds like utopian or utilitarian. We bring our own associations to it. He started designing them in the Great Depression. You could buy a Frank Lloyd Wright designed house complete with furniture inside for about $5,000, which I think was a bargain back then and would definitely be a bargain today. By the time he designed the Zimmerman House in Manchester, it was, the house was completed in 1952, so we are post-World War II. He's got clients now that have a little bit more money, and so he can add some special bells and whistles to these simple, modest houses that are supposed to be kind of in and of the earth here. So we see what looks like a modest ranch house. This is 2 beds, 2 bathrooms, about 8 1,800 square feet, and it is a long, low house. This is the view that you always see of the Zimmerman house because it is so hard to photograph. Once you go into the driveway, you kind of need like a fisheye angle here. It gets a little tricky. It's a very long facade, but notice that this facade is very protective. This is a brick wall with these concrete blocks up above that it's essentially like a ribbon of windows here, but it's protection. It's a fortress from the world around you. This is your retreat that Frank Lloyd Wright has built. And it has this carport. Now forgive me, I'm going to gush about a carport. Frank Lloyd Wright did not invent carports, but he did coin the term. And he thought, garages are like stables for horses, but cars don't need stables. You don't need a full garage. So he says, well, we'll just do a carport. And I'm sure many of you have garages, and you know the experience of coming home, parking your car in the garage, and you see all your stuff. Right? There's the bikes, there's the trash cans, there's, the wiggling out of your door. And here at the Zimmerman house, when you pull in at home, what you see is like the cinematic letterbox view through your house to your backyard. And this is actually a part of the house that's built into the ground. So this wall here is roughly chest height, and the land just beyond it is roughly chest height. Now to come home and to see this greenery, or to see the snow falling, or the rain trickling down, it just makes you breathe deeper. It sets the stage for relaxation. It's one of the smartest, most wonderful things about this house. So then you head to the front door. And Frank Lloyd Wright famously hid a lot of his front doors over the years. And this isn't an impossible to find front door, but it's certainly understated. It is marked by this granite boulder here, which is nowhere near as heroic as a waterfall in southwestern Pennsylvania, but it is one of the most prominent features of this landscape, and Wright thought he'd play that up a little bit. Once you go inside this house that seems so fortress-like on the front, you head into what Frank Lloyd Wright called the garden room. This would be your living room, right? And it's not exactly the plush couches that we're used to today. There is this long bench seating here with cushions, and that's where you would sit. It doesn't necessarily look like the most comfortable place to sit either, right? But there's method to Wright's madness here, because everything in this room is sort of organized around basic geometries. Wright loved to do this, and in this case, this basic geometry, his building block is a 4-foot by 4-foot square. And if you have really good eyes, you might even be able to see that there's a 4-foot by 4-foot grid of these squares on the floor, kind of covered up by the rugs. But even the back of that banquette there are roughly 4-foot by 4-foot cushions. So this is supposed to create this visual harmony. And harmony is the name of the game here too, because you can see all the musical instruments. The Zimmermans loved music, and so Wright was sort of thinking about having everything integrated together. This is what he called organic architecture. We've got these beautiful autumnal colors. We've got unadorned surfaces. The beautiful wood in the ceiling is, it's not painted. It speaks for itself in its beauty. These gorgeous Roman bricks too, each one of them just pristine. So all of these elements coming together to form this idea of organic architecture. Now you'd sit down on this long banquette. There's no TV in this room. What are you supposed to do? Well, just across from that banquette, through these bays, are these windows. And these windows are literally framing up nature. Frank Lloyd Wright is saying the beautiful thing to look at in this house is actually outdoors. And he's doing everything he can to bring the outdoors in, to break the box. So there's a planter just outside this glass, and there's a planter inside this glass to create this seamless transition here. And the glass goes all the way up right into the roof, which creates this seamless transition from indoors to outdoors. Now, I would argue that Frank Lloyd Wright is even trying to echo nature in the way that he designed his house. We can see these brick piers here. They're supposed to echo the form of the tree trunks outside. We even have diffused lighting in the ceiling, echoing the experience of light filtering down through the leaves of the trees. So in everything he's doing, he's bringing the outdoors in. Now, here is a view back through that room, and there is the fireplace. For Frank Lloyd Wright, that is the center of every home, and it's sort of the center of family life. He's still thinking like this even in the 1950s. And this is where he as an architect is showing off a little bit too. Because the most basic, the most fundamental principle in architecture is like post and lintel design. You have two posts and a lintel that spans it horizontally. Well, we have one post here. But where is the other one? This is a mass of bricks hanging up here, and it's only supported on one side. That's a little scary, right? How are you certain that the mass of bricks is not going to fall? Well, Mrs. Zimmerman had a great deal of faith in her architect. She liked to sit right there and just sort of tempt fate. There is steel in that structure there to hold those bricks up. So we can see just above her head here, there are some shelves that wrap around the corner, and they're going to take us into what Frank Lloyd Wright called the dining loggia. The Zimmermans didn't even get a dining room. They got a dining hallway, really. But when you think about it, it's actually brilliant. Because I don't know how many of you have a formal dining room in your house. If you do, you might, like me, think that it's kind of a waste of space. You don't use it that often. So Frank Lloyd Wright thought, this is a house for two people. We'll just have this small dining room table off to the side. This is a main corridor in the house. But then we're going to put all of these glass and screen doors on the other side. So the Zimmermans can dine essentially outside for half of the year and enjoy that fresh air, the connection to nature outside. It's brilliant. You might be thinking, yeah, but what if you have a guest over? They're just supposed to sit on this little footrest here? Well, luckily for the Zimmermans, everything that Frank Lloyd Wright designed had these harmonious proportions. So all of the chairs are roughly 13 inches off the ground. All of the tables are roughly double that, 26 inches. And that vertical grid continues on with the shelves here, continues on with the board and batten in the ceiling, and it equals about 5 layers of brick and mortar. So that vertical grid exists throughout the house. And what that means is that you can take this table, bring it back to your garden room here. This hexagonal table opens up, your dining room table fits in there, and then you can have all these guests sitting at your banquette, looking at your backyard, enjoying that space together. I just think that's so smart. So the last room that I'd like to show you at the Zimmermans' house is their primary bedroom. Whenever I gave tours of this house, people were always so disappointed by this space because they're getting ready for something big. And this is a very humble space. But let's face it, we don't spend a lot of time in our bedrooms. The Zimmermans only had a full-size bed. It's a very small space. Frank Lloyd Wright saves them a lot of floor space by levitating their bookshelves here. And again, the floor is this poured concrete with the 4-foot by 4-foot grid. The beauty is really up above. You're falling asleep at night. You can see this beautifully milled wooden ceiling here that is constructed in such a way that it looks like there is no definition between the indoors and the outdoors. There's a lot about this that reminds me of like a vacation house. When you look at the house from the backyard, especially illuminated at twilight, I mean, it's all glass. It's like a lantern. This is a house that prioritizes the view to the backyard and that connection to the outdoors. So even though you're in Manchester here, you feel like you're a world away. And Wright's design was incredibly influential, so influential in fact that Dr. Zimmerman's colleague, Dr. Khalil, said, I want one of these houses myself. He got in touch with Frank Lloyd Wright, and just a few years later, he had his own Usonian house just down the street, which I'm sure everyone here knows was recently acquired by the Currier Museum of Art, making it the only museum in the world that owns 2 Wright-designed properties. And we're so lucky that we can go and tour both of them, and that they're so different from each other. They provide such an interesting conversation. So if you haven't haven't been to the Khalil house yet, I don't have any images for you tonight. You're going to have to go and see it for yourself. Okay, so we have 2 architects left and just a little bit of time. We're going to switch gears from looking at houses to looking at libraries. And the first library we're going to look at was designed by the architect Louis Kahn. Now, he emigrated from the Russian Empire when he was just 6 years old. By the time he was 35, he had already opened his own architectural firm, and he later taught at UPenn and Yale. What we're looking at over here is one of his early major designs. This is the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences or Research. This is in San Diego. And so we're looking at a view sort of out towards the ocean. And it's kind of hard to make sense out of what you're seeing here, but it gives you the impression of like this massive, heavy buildings, sort of fortress-like. They don't hide their materials. Jonas Salk, who commissioned Louis Kahn to make this structure, was absolutely delighted by it. We could spend a lot of time looking at it, but we're going to move back to New Hampshire now, because Phillips Exeter Academy was interested in designing, building a brand new library towards the end of the 1960s. They wanted something that was related to the Georgian Revival architecture that was on campus, all this brick, but they also wanted something distinct. The director of the school said, we want to hire the most important contemporary architect on the planet to design this. And it was actually Jonas Salk, whose son went to Exeter, who said, why don't you work with Louis Kahn? I just had a great experience with him. So the result is this massive, sort of cube-like building here that kind of looks like it has the edges shaved off. We're looking at it from sort of a diagonal angle here. Now this is all brick masonry work as we're looking at the exterior. And we're gonna get just a little bit closer. This is very different brick from what we saw at the Zimmerman house, that pristine, smooth brick. There's a lot of texture here. There's a lot of wood, teak, and glass in the surface of this building. What I want to draw your attention to, and what I think is really easy to miss, because this is brickwork, what you'll see at the bottom are these massive brick piers that slowly get thinner and thinner and thinner and lighter until you get to the top up here, and it's not even like a finished story. This is like an open air walkway. And Louis Kahn had a great description for this. He said, the way it's structured like this, that the weight of the brick makes it dance like a fairy above and groan down below. So at the bottom here, you don't see any primary entrance. Louis Kahn sort of hated the idea of making a big deal about a front door, but once you're inside that shadowy arcade, you find the main entrance, and then there's these grand staircases leading you up one level to this incredible atrium here. The atrium is, once again, defined by these kind of raw materials. There's a lot of concrete, and on each side, there's a huge hole cut through it, so you have a little bit of wayfinding there. You can see the stacks in the books on the other side of that concrete. Now, I won't go too deep into it, but the rough proportions here are supposed to kind of harken back to classical architects, to Vitruvius, and his interest in proportions and perfect geometries. There's a little bit of a reference to the Vitruvian Man, Da Vinci's answer to Vitruvius, and this notion that, you know, a perfect human form could fit inside these perfect geometries here. The dimensions are also kind of correspond to the golden ratio. So as simple as the geometries are here, Louis Kahn had put a lot of thought into it. And so this massive space that I think the ceiling is something like 70 feet over your head, it creates, this sense of awe when you walk into the space. You feel like you're in a temple, and it's a temple of learning. And if you're really brave and you look up, you see this massive X, this massive concrete X hanging over your head. And you have to have a lot of faith in Louis Kahn that it's going to stay there. So if we're looking at sort of a cutaway of the building, this is like looking down from the sky at the building. And at the third floor, we have the atrium. Louis Kahn said there's like donuts to this building. So the center donut is that atrium. All around it are the stacks. There is steel in the building there to support the weight of the books. And then this outer donut is where we saw that brickwork in the masonry. Just inside from those windows are these study carrels. And there's over 200 of them in the library. They're right by the windows. They even have these like little sliding panels so you can modulate how much light you have as you're working. Louis Kahn had this nice kind of romantic philosophy. He said, a library begins with a man finding a book and then going to the light. And so that's what he wanted to provide for the young men at Phillips Exeter. So you start in the stacks and then you head over to those study corrals. What you can see here too, in the image over here on the right, is that for each level, there's a main floor and then a mezzanine within it. This was an ingenious thing that Louis Kahn did. There were building codes in Exeter at the time saying that you couldn't build a building more than 4 stories high. So he just added a mezzanine to every level and essentially made a 9-story building by skirting those building codes. So we wrap up our look at the Phillips Exeter Academy Library with this last view and the striking beam of light kind of flooding down here. This is a building that was awarded the 25-year medal after it was done by the American Institute of Architects, and that's a medal that goes to any building, any architect really, that has created something that has this kind of lasting power, this staying power. And Louis Kahn was so humble to the end, he said, I just put a roof over it. What an understatement. So, our last architect for the evening, a woman and someone who's still alive. We have Maya Lin, and I think people know her best because of her design, her winning design of the Vietnam War Memorial. She was just an undergraduate at Yale when she won that blind competition. There is that design for that very powerful memorial down in Washington, D.C. that honors all of the American lives that were lost during the Vietnam War. Now, since then, Maya Lin has had a very distinguished career creating sculpture, creating other monuments and memorials. She sort of moved away from that recently, but in recent years, she was tasked with redesigning the library at Smith College, and that's what we're looking at here. Historic photos of the library at Smith College. I believe this was a Carnegie library. It's sort of a Renaissance revival style library. It was over 100 years old. It's called the Nielsen Library. And over the years, it had several additions that basically created this dark warren of stacks inside this library that were really unpleasant to use. It also created this huge physical barrier on the campus of Smith College, which was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. So there was this notion that you couldn't really get around this huge building. Now this was a personal quest for Maya Lin because her mother had attended Smith College. Her mother had escaped communist China with her acceptance letter to Smith and 2 $10 bills sewn into her clothes. It's how she left the country. And so Maya Lin thinks, if Smith didn't exist, I wouldn't exist. So this is, in some ways, almost like a love letter to her mother. But what does she do? She basically takes that building apart down to the walls. But she left those walls because I think we all know, especially when we're thinking about our alma maters, we have a real profound sentimental connection to the architecture on college campuses. She knew there were some things that were sacred. She didn't want to mess with it. So she puts it back together. She redesigns the entire interior of the original Nielsen Library and then adds these new wings to it, which are a little bit more right-sized for the campus. Some of the design work was happening in the midst of the pandemic, so you can see wide open spaces here, room to breathe inside. But she did design this library with the idea that this was a place that had to be flexible, it had to be a place for gatherings, for meetings, for collaborative work. That was almost more important to her than the books themselves. What we can see over here, this white streak on the edge, is actually almost like a a sundial. There's an oculus in the ceiling, and this 74-foot sheet of white that brings all of that light from the roof all the way down to the basement, kind of illuminating the whole library in an interesting way. And the basement is actually where most of the books are, which is really smart design on her part too, because you don't have to add all the steel. And it's collapsible stacks. So really just making very good use of the space where the books were going to be. Those cloud-like wings that we see on either side of the building, clad in limestone here, using some metal, some glass here, very modern materials to contrast with the original building. When you go inside, they're informal, they're kind of welcoming spaces. You almost feel like you're heading into a Starbucks in some ways. You can look up, you can look down, you can easily spot your friends. This is a world away from the temple of learning that was at Phillips Exeter Academy. So everything is designed to be kind of cozy, comfortable, accessible. What about all those study carrels that we saw at Phillips Exeter? Well, there are some at this library too. They don't have to be right next to the glass because everybody's reading on their computer screens, right? They're mostly not reading from books. So she prioritizes the natural sunlight for places for people to meet. And just outside the library, she designed a memorial garden for her mother there, which is so sweet. And then like a built-in amphitheater on the college campus grounds. So right alongside the library is a gathering space and a performance space. So here's our last glamour shot of the Nielsen Library. When this library was finished, when it was revealed, it was, the dominant part of the conversation was that it was still during the pandemic and people were talking about that. But they were also very mindful of the fact that Maya Lin had lost her husband, I think 6 months into the planning process or actually just 6 months before the library opened. So even though she doesn't design memorials anymore, I think in some ways people were thinking of this library as functioning like a memorial to her husband. And in some ways it provided this really beautiful bookend to her very auspicious beginnings as a designer. Her work, of course, is not over. She continues to make really interesting art and sculptures, mostly related to climate change these days. I wish I could show you all of that too. But for now, we will just wrap up with a couple of quick ideas. In our little survey of modern architecture in New England, we've seen some buildings that were designed to connect to nature using a variety of materials and means. We've seen some modern and contemporary architects maximize light and oftentimes use it for dramatic effect. And then we saw architects using unusual materials and forms. The modern architecture in New England hasn't just broken the mold. These architects have set a new standard for revolutionary approaches to design worldwide. Thank you. Please enjoy some refreshments out here, and I'll try my best to connect with anybody who wants to chat. We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes. Thank you. I think those modern buildings got some people excited here. I think people are thinking about what it would be like to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, or a house that's, for all intents and purposes, a greenhouse. A lot of questions about heating and cooling during the intervention. So welcome back. We're going to turn our attention to a woman who's been called the mother of modernism. That is Georgia O'Keeffe. Tonight is Beyond the Blossoms. We've all heard of Georgia O'Keeffe's flower paintings, but they only represent about 10% of her artistic output. We're going to get a sense of what else she did during her nice long life and career. This is a gorgeous image that's sort of like a flower. She simply called it Blue and Green Music from 1921. It's a little bit of a preview of what's to come. I am not going to fully deny you the flowers, though. We'll just start with a few of them just so we're all on the same page. It's a flower fix. This is the resplendent red canna from 1924. It's in a private collection. And it's truly an intimate look at a flower. It's painted on an almost monumental scale. It's almost 3 feet tall. And in this picture, we see every ripple, every fold, these gorgeous undulating lines. And as your eye moves around this flower, you discover new colors. There's lavenders in here. There's oranges up here. It's like a walk through the inside of a flower. And it's so specific, but at the same time, it feels like the archetype of a beautiful flower. It's just truly gorgeous. Now, I wanted to start with this picture, not just because it's beautiful, but because it's important to recognize that floral still lifes, by extension floral botanicals, have always been relegated to women, going back centuries. This is a painting by a woman artist from the 1700s. And the most famous woman painter, Georgia O'Keeffe, really derives her fame from painting a traditionally feminine subject. Would she have been as successful or popular today if she had never painted a flower? It's an interesting question, isn't it? What if she didn't fit into the preordained mold that society has for women? We'll see throughout the program tonight that O'Keeffe's she had very relatable struggles in terms of working with society's expectations and finding her own independence. Her life is sort of like the embodiment of the modern question of how can a woman have it all? How do you negotiate family and career and the men in your lives? So O'Keeffe never wanted to be known as a woman artist. She just simply wanted to be known as an artist. But I think fully appreciating her work means you have to acknowledge that she was up against a lot. She was a woman in a male-dominated field, and when she started painting, she was still legally a second-class citizen. She didn't have the right to vote. It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? So the last flowers we'll look at are these 2 gorgeous white flowers. We've got 2 calla lilies in pink. That's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then on the right, we have the white iris from 1930. That's at the Tate in London. So with all that being said, these flowers are irresistible, aren't they? There's a critic who is contemporary to the artist who wrote about these pictures and how they make you feel like you're a little butterfly sitting on the wing or sitting on the petals of these flowers. We're all butterflies when we look at her work. And the flower paintings got Georgia O'Keeffe noticed. In fact, in 1928, 6 of her flower paintings sold for $25,000, which is almost $500,000 in today's money, which would have been not just a very nice payday, it would have been the highest amount paid for work by an American artist ever. So she was doing very well for herself very early on. So let's turn our attention to how we'll spend our time with Georgia O'Keeffe. We're going to do a very brief introduction to the artist, who you can see here in a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. There will be a lot of Stieglitz photographs of her tonight. We'll turn our attention to major places. New York, what was she painting there? New Mexico, what did she do there? And then her work, her explorations in other media, and her legacy. She would have been about 45 years old in this picture, and I just love that wry smile. We're going to be getting more of it. Okay, so here is our very quick introduction to Georgia O'Keeffe. She was actually born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin in 1887. Her family were farmers. This is the farmhouse that she was born into. She was born into a very large family. She had 2 younger sisters. We can see them over here. And she was the second born out of 7, the oldest girl. So she kind of had this primary role in her family. Her family would move around quite a bit throughout her lifetime, and and then she would move around quite a bit, even into her 20s. But we can see her here as a young woman. This is an example of one of her drawings here too. And here she is with some of her art supplies, a little bit older. She had an early inclination for the arts. Her parents supported that. She and her sisters got drawing classes, and we can see just how carefully she's looking. I think this is one of her sisters in the drawing that she made at age 13. So by the early years of the 1900s, she is frequently traveling. She's just kind of crisscrossing the country from Illinois to Texas, Virginia to South Carolina and New York City. She pursued her education in the arts at schools including the Art Institute of Chicago and the Art Students League. And from there she did a little bit of commercial art. But where she landed, and where a lot of women landed, was in art education. And so she would kind of move away from home, she would launch herself, and then what typically happened in those early years is that she would get very sick, and she'd have to return to her family. So one time she got measles, one time she got typhoid fever, she'd go back home, she'd recuperate, and then she'd try to launch herself again. Now, as an art teacher, one of the things that she started doing that she found, I think, incredibly rewarding, professionally rewarding, was she would attend these summer classes at the University of Virginia. They were taught by a man named Arthur Wesley Dow, who was the head of the art department at Columbia University, or at Teachers College at Columbia. And he introduced like a revolutionary concept to Georgia O'Keeffe. He said, essentially, paintings don't have to be trying to copy what you see in the world around you. Instead, art is really about design. It should be the expression of a scene through design, through composition, and instead of trying to replicate the world around you, try to like make a composition. And so we can see her focusing on this while she's on the campus of UVA. She is focused on symmetry, she's focused on paring down elements to more geometric simplicity, a real sort of simplification of forms here, sort of leaning towards abstraction. So she so loved what Arthur Wesley Dow was talking about. She moves to New York City, she's studying directly under him, and she's making these kinds of charcoal drawings, these abstractions. These were pretty novel at the time. There weren't a lot of other artists who were creating these kinds of images. Now, without her really knowing, one of her friends sent a few of her drawings to a modern art gallery in New York City. And the man who ran that gallery really liked what he saw, and he started this conversation through letters with Georgia O'Keeffe. His name was Alfred Stieglitz, and over the next few decades, they would write 25,000 pages of letters to each other. They were sort of hyper connected to each other. If they were alive today, I think they'd be constantly texting. So it sort of started off with an interest in art, in each other's art, because he was a photographer, a great photographer in his own right. But then she began to write things to him like, I'm getting to like you so tremendously that it sometimes scares me. Having told you so much about myself, more than I've told anybody else, could anything else follow but that I should want you? So this sort of begins this real relationship. This is her future husband. This is Alfred Stieglitz. Here he is standing in that modernist art gallery that he owned, where he exhibited modern photography and modern works by European artists and by American artists. It's an understatement to say that Alfred Stieglitz was like the mover and shaker in modern art in America at the time. She connected with very much the right person. So he was an interesting person, sort of a challenging person. One art historian said Stieglitz was an immensely charismatic person, amazingly egotistical and narcissistic, but he had this ability to establish a deep communion with people. There was one other wrinkle in this budding romance between Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. He was 23 years older than her, and he was married. So that created a little bit of a wrinkle. But in 1918, he underwrites a year of her working in New York City. So she comes to New York City to paint, and he's going to pay for it. And what happens? She gets sick again. And it's 1918, I wonder if it was the Spanish flu. But here she is, essentially like his patient. He's her landlord, he's her business manager, her caretaker. He's really kind of telling her what and how to paint. And it starts this very complicated, lopsided power dynamic. in their relationship. Now, he spends a couple weeks with her and he says, I'm leaving my wife. He's ready to stay with Georgia O'Keeffe. She is 31 years old at the time, he is 54, and she begins to kind of blossom under all this attention that she's getting from him. She becomes a frequent subject of his photographs. He loved her hand. She has these very elegant, long fingers, and of course, they're connected to her creative output, and she was a lovely lady. Because of the nature of their relationship, most likely, Alfred Stieglitz also took a lot of pretty steamy, beautiful pictures of Georgia O'Keeffe. And then, in 1921, he exhibited them publicly. So it's safe to say this created quite a sensation with the public and with the critics. Even looking back on it, Georgia O'Keeffe was like, these were created with a certain kind of heat. But just as today, I think that the public is sort of uncomfortable, or maybe a little bit more uncomfortable with a nude photograph as opposed to a painted nude. There's just an element of realism here that can be sort of uncomfortable for people. And I don't want to say that she only became famous because there were nude photos of her out in the world, but that certainly helped her star to rise. So just a year or two later, Alfred Stieglitz stages a huge exhibition of her works, over 100 works. It's 1923. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of the egotism of Alfred Stieglitz, he names this exhibition of her work, Alfred Stieglitz Presents 100 Pictures, Oils, Watercolors, Pastels, Drawings by Georgia O'Keeffe. So he kind of comes first. These were the kinds of images that she was exhibiting at that time. They spent a lot of time at Lake George, so you get like the peacefulness of upstate New York here. And these were the kinds of images that we tend to see with Georgia O'Keeffe. They're tranquil, they're kind of these simplified landscapes, these soft, sensual lines here as well. Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe got married the following year when his divorce was finalized. Now, to go back to the flowers for just a little bit, I'm sure all of you have at one point heard the theory that these flowers are not just flowers, right? That there's something other than that there's something related to female anatomy. And I've seen rooms full of grown adults blushing and giggling at these flowers before because we've all heard that theory. Or you come to your own conclusion looking at it. And it was actually her husband who put forward that theory about her flowers, and she vehemently denied it for about 6 decades. Did anyone listen? It sort of brings up the whole problem of like who gets to decide what paintings are really about and how to interpret them. We'll return to this very interesting partnership in just a moment, but for now, we're going to turn our attention to what Georgia O'Keeffe was doing in the first few years after their marriage. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe are living in New York City, and they move into the Shelton Hotel. When the Shelton Hotel was built in 1924, it was the tallest building in the world. She was one of the first American artists to live in a skyscraper. It's kind of wild to think about, right? So here she is living in New York and really trying to find a mode of expression for capturing these skyscrapers. What are they supposed to look like in paintings? And so a lot of her early paintings are sort of like that feeling of being a tourist in New York City where you're just wowed by looking up. These buildings oftentimes seem to loom over her, especially this one with this curving cornice up here, and it's just a monolith. There's no windows, there's no openings, there's no relief from this huge structural mass. And so Georgia O'Keeffe was always trying to find a way to kind of soften these hard edges in the city. We've got the halo of light here. We've got the rippling illuminated clouds from the moon up above. So trying to find a way to do it. So she produces this picture in 1925. She shows it to her husband, and her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, says, let's let the men try and figure out how to do the skyscrapers. They're still working on that. Why don't you stick to the flowers? Well, the following year, he did exhibit this work, and it sold immediately. for $1,200, which in today's money would be like $25,000. So there's a later interview with Georgia O'Keeffe later on in life where she said, after that, they let me paint the city. So she continued to paint skyscrapers and to try and wrestle with this problem of like softening the hard edges of the city. This is the Shelton Hotel where she lived, painted in 1926, and it's called the Shelton with Sunspots. She talked about like walking out onto the sidewalk one day and it looked like a bite of the building had been taken out of the side, and it was just the light sort of coming around the edge here. We can see her playing with a little bit of geometric abstraction here with the like these little globes of the sunspots, counterbalancing the little rectangle windows there. And then we have all this energy of the smoke and the steam of the city providing these undulating lines all around. The basic composition here, the basic ideas are still what she had kind of internalized back at UVA with Arthur Wesley Dow. So we see that as being like the foundation for her work. Now, she continued to paint skyscrapers. Some of them are a little bit more ominous than others. This one's called City Night from 1926. And this one actually represents something that happens in photography. She was very aware of how things translate in photography because she's married to a photographer. And in this picture, what we're seeing is the suggestion of a vertical convergence. So if those buildings were to extend infinitely up into the sky, they'd overlap, right? And that definitely gives you this sense of dread walking underneath them. We can see that she's added a few stars, maybe a moon, maybe a lamppost here to give us a little bit of relief from these monoliths. I also want to just mention how she's painting right now. This is a style that's called precisionism. The effort here is to make your brushstrokes invisible. It almost looks like it's machine made. Like the most striking contrast I can think of is like an American Impressionist view of New York City from about 10 years earlier, where every brushstroke is unblended and short and quick and visible. Georgia O'Keeffe is making an effort, taking pains to smooth out those lines and make very precise sort of fields of color here. Now, occasionally her work would be in dialogue with her husbands. Here they are living in one of the tallest buildings in the world. This is her husband's photograph of, I think this is the East River, and this is her painting, which you can almost imagine them working side by side, right? Her take on this is a little bit different, but every time I see her trying to create a painting that's in dialogue with her husband, I feel like it's forced. She does sort of play up the light off of the water a little bit more than the photograph does, but otherwise, it just doesn't sing to me at all. She did another work of essentially the same location, and she was like sort of unbound by trying to match it to a photograph, and we can see her adding in these colors, fantastic colors, and like the sunspots up above, and she creates this like visionary sort of industrial landscape out beyond out there at the East River that to me this kind of sings a little bit more. So when she sticks to her own mode of expression, it seems to be particularly successful. One last skyscraper for you, and this, I believe, is her last skyscraper. This is the Radiator Building from 1927. It's really celebrated as kind of like the grand finale of her skyscrapers. The Radiator Building has this really distinctive roof line here. It's a little bit Gothic, a little bit Art Deco, and now we see the city. It's illuminated sort of outside the building and from within the building. The building itself seems to be like humming with activity here, and we see the glow of all of these, well, the suggestion of like lampposts down below. She does something really interesting in this picture. I know it might be a little bit hard to see, but she puts her husband's name in lights, literally, in neon lights. Alfred Stieglitz, right over here. And you can almost think of it as like a double portrait. maybe you can think of this element here as her self-portrait. These kind of sinewy, undulating lines of the steam coming off of this building. It's sort of like that abstract work that we started with. We almost get the sense like these are searchlights or something, but they're filtering the color of that steam in the green and the blue. So it's a great work. I love this work. But just 2 years later, the stock market would crash, and what had been sort of a symbol of American, ingenuity suddenly becomes a symbol of American failure. Nobody really wants to think about skyscrapers after 1929. And that's right around the time that Georgia O'Keeffe decides to get out of town. And so we're going to turn our attention to some of the paintings that she created when she started going to New Mexico in 1929. This really marks the most critical shift in her career. This is a time when her forms become sharper and clearer. We see a little bit more overt symbolism, religious symbolism. So Georgia O'Keeffe had visited New Mexico before. She'd sort of driven through. But once she went in 1929, she said, I was always on my way back. She just loved it. And ultimately, she started spending like half of every year away from her husband in the Southwest. So her paintings of New Mexico are paintings that most powerfully evoke a sense of place. This is called Black Mesa Landscape from 1930. And before looking at this, I probably would never say that somebody could paint a sexy mountain, but I think this is a pretty sexy mountain. We see all of these like ruts in this canyon over here. It almost looks like a pile of rumpled sheets on a bed, doesn't it? It almost feels like there's a human form underneath here. There's just these beautiful, again, kind of undulating lines here and gorgeous color choices going back from the peach here to the black to that indigo and violet in the background. She said, when I got to New Mexico, that was mine. As soon as I saw it, that was my country. I'd never seen anything like it before, and it fitted to me exactly. So she is drawn to this landscape, to say the least, and she's drawn to the architecture as well. This is the back of a church that she painted several times. This was her first shot at painting the church. She said, out here, half your work is done for you. But what she's presenting to us in this view is a church that doesn't have any windows or any doors. We're not quite sure what we're looking at when you first look at this church. Instead, it looks like this form that is melded to the landscape. These could be like natural rock outcroppings in some ways, right? But then there are elements here that look man-made. It's sort of hard to wrestle with exactly what we're looking at, but the forms here, there's like this wonderful softness to it. It doesn't seem like a hard building. So this is her idiom. This is what she loves. She also was so moved by all of the crosses that she saw in the Southwest. She said it was like a thin, dark veil of the Catholic Church spread over the New Mexico landscape. So she painted these crosses several times. You can probably just make out that she includes like the wooden kind of bolts that hold those crosses together, and they stand like monoliths in the desert landscape. One critic sort of attacked this work in particular, though. He said it looked like there's like an infinite number of elephants that are moving just under the cross. But she does capture that landscape so beautifully here, and I am a sucker for these blues and how she's kind of dotted the night sky with those stars there. In some ways, it is like the peaceful response to all of the energy and vitality that we saw with the Radiator building just a couple years earlier. So I want to introduce you to just one of my favorite Georgia O'Keeffes of all time. This is called the Lawrence Tree from 1929. While she was visiting New Mexico, she visited the cabin of this writer named D.H. Lawrence, who was particularly focused on like the dehumanizing effects of modern existence. Speaks right to what she's interested in too. This is a woman escaping New York City. And just outside his cabin was this ponderosa pine tree, and she names it after him, so we can sort of think of it as like a symbolic portrait. What I love about this painting is that we're seeing this tree from such an unusual angle. You know she's right there close to the trunk. She's looking up at these like octopus-like branches, and then seeing through those branches, seeing through the pine to, you know, the globe of heaven up above. And when you're looking at this picture, you can imagine yourself there. And every time I see this picture, it's like I am breathing in the fresh, pure air of the American Southwest. I am right there with her next to this tree. So the tree, in some ways, with this strange angle, seems to be related to those unusual angles that she was painting the skyscrapers initially. But again, because it's a natural form, it just, there's tremendous comfort, I think, in looking at this work as opposed to a little bit of the uncertainty that you might feel when you see this. Now, you might have seen the ponderosa pine, the Lawrence tree, looking a little bit different. I had to double check this when I initially put this program together, because I was like, I swear to God, I saw it hanging in a completely different direction. And when I did a Google search, it comes back sort of oriented in all of these different ways. Apparently, there's no right way to hang this picture. It is down in the collection of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. And when Georgia O'Keeffe went to see it there, if I'm remembering correctly, it was hanging like this, which was sort of upside down to how she painted it, and she loved it. So it's an interesting, flexible image that way. All right, she's spending all this time in New Mexico. How does this impact this very close relationship that she has with her husband? What we're looking at here is a little love note, because she's spending about 6 months of the year in New Mexico. She called it the far away. And because of that, she and her husband are writing each other all these letters. Like in one night, he'd write her a 20-page letter. So he's terrified of losing her, and maybe terrified of losing control and influence that he had over her career. He could tell her where to exhibit her work, how much to price it for, what she should be painting. And she's got a little bit more flexibility out here. But they're still in love mode. She left this note for him in the apartment. She would leave little notes around for him. Hello, I kiss you. And then he would annotate the notes when he found them, and he'd put the date where he found when he found it and where he found it. So this note he found in his slippers. So they're in constant communication, but there's another big thorn in this relationship. He was carrying on a very open affair with a much younger woman, a woman who was only 21 years old. Her name was Dorothy Norman. Here she is, and in the center of this picture over here too. She was 7 years younger than Stieglitz's daughter from his first marriage. So this was quite a scandal, and he was integrating Dorothy Norman into his business of running this gallery. And so this caused, for Georgia O'Keeffe, this caused great distress, and ultimately really increased her anxiety. She was sliding into depression. She was unable to eat and to sleep. She developed a fear of water and a fear that buildings were collapsing on top of her. She suffered and sort of endured all of this cheating until 1933, when she had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for 2 months. She recovered by herself in New Mexico. And the best thing to come out of that was that she, it drove her to really find herself and find her place and find this sense of independence from her unfaithful husband. So she started creating the kinds of paintings that really mattered to her. And these are two great representations of that passion. These are probably, other than her flower paintings, her best known paintings. She became a painter of animal bones. And in the same way that her flower paintings were not pictures about sex, the animal bones are not pictures about death, if you can believe it. So this is Summer Days over here from 1936, and this is Ram's Head, White Hollyhock, and New Mexico from 1935. So when you look at these images, I want you to imagine her appreciating these animal skulls in the same way that she was appreciating all of the ripples and folds of those flowers that we saw before. She is just interested in the forms, these weathered surfaces, the rough edges, the jagged openings. This was all so appealing to her. Okay, so why are they hanging up in the sky over the desert landscape? That's just a little bit of surrealist flair here, and the surrealists loved what she was doing. This is 1930, this is like the 30s. It's the heyday of surrealism. So they actually asked Georgia O'Keeffe to start exhibiting with them, and you'll just love her response. She simply said, "I'm not a joiner," and just continued doing what she was doing. I don't think she wanted anyone else to control her artistic output. She wanted her own say in things. So I absolutely love this photograph of her. Here she is standing in the desert, smiling broadly, holding like the rib cage of an animal. She would walk through the desert, picking up bones the way most of us would walk through a meadow and pick wild flowers. And over here in this photograph from later on in her life, you can see this animal bone collection that she had amassed there. Now, she continued to focus on animal bones and sometimes kind of looking through them, using them as framing devices in her pictures. These works were done between 1943 and 1945. One art historian put this so beautifully. She said that these works demonstrate O'Keeffe's ability to present the universe through the portal of a bone. But for O'Keeffe, she said she just always loved that peek at the blue sky. She said she could be in jail just as long as she could always see a little slice of blue sky there. And these animal bones, these pelvises, give us just that wonderful view. Now, shortly after finishing those works, Alfred Stieglitz suffered a heart attack. It was 1946, and Georgia O'Keeffe immediately went back to New York City. The day after he died, she took control of his gallery, wrestled it away from Dorothy Norman, his mistress, and she took control of the entire body of his artistic output, 2,500 photographs. So now she was the one with control. She donated about 1,600 of those photographs to the National Gallery of Art, kind of cementing his place in the history of photography. And at that same time, as she's like suffering the loss of her husband, she was actually honored with the first, she was the first woman honored with a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. So her career was taking off at a time of all of this personal turmoil. But now she was kind of free. She bought a permanent residence in New Mexico and spent some years settling her husband's estate and getting it remodeled. She said she was kind of obsessed with this hacienda, particularly because of this door here. She said, "I would have no peace until I bought that house." So it's an Adobe style house. Here is the view of what it looked like when she lived there, these big windows, and from inside you can see that landscape that she loved to paint so much. This is a house that is all about the connection to nature. Wow, what a gorgeous tree out there, right? So let's turn our attention now to another facet of her artistic production, several other facets. I'm going to start off by just acknowledging that Georgia O'Keeffe was one of the most photographed women of the 20th century. It's like Princess Diana, Georgia O'Keeffe. Kind of makes sense considering how her career started, right? But she became this fascinating person to everyone in her own right that continues to this day. Usually exhibitions of her paintings or other works are accompanied by her actual clothing. People are just fascinated by her aesthetic. But because she was somebody who just wanted to be known as an artist and not a woman artist, she projected a very, very serious countenance in all of these photos. And these are photos for like Time and Vogue. And so she actually kind of cultivated this reputation of being a crabby old hermit out in the desert. But look what happens when Georgia O'Keeffe gets behind the camera. She's having a field day. Now, this is someone who is married to a photographer. She knew a thing or two about photography. And this was just an opportunity for her to play. People would gift her cameras for Christmas or for her birthday, and she would take it out into the desert, and she started snapping pictures the same way she was snapping up bones that she could find. And this wasn't necessarily about her artistic process. Sometimes she would take a photo that was actually very similar to a painting that she had made. So obviously cameras allowed her to kind of zoom in and crop in interesting ways, but this is a 1944 painting. This is a photograph from 1965. So in some ways it was like an opportunity to reflect on what she had been doing. In other cases, it was a chance for her to explore a subject that she was particularly interested in. That door that forced her to buy the house or else she'd never have peace, she photographed it again and again and again. And then she would ultimately paint it many times over too. And somehow she made this black opening here, this black portal, look just so interesting and fantastic through, panes of glass or through light snow like this. But for her, the photographs weren't necessarily works of art. She would make a little contact sheet, she would print it and just use it as bookmarks or give it away to friends. She also, this is unfair to say, she dabbled in sculpture as well. She started making some three-dimensional works. She called them all abstractions. This is abstraction from 1946 here at the center, and it's this white spiral. This is lacquered bronze. She would make the maquette and then have it professionally cast. And so we see, it's almost like a number 6 that continues to curl and then curls back against itself. And I have here on the screen other paintings that she did that are absolutely related and so similar. I mean, she's certainly interested in a white spiral. In some ways, this isn't a sculpture that you even look at, it's a sculpture that you look through. It's like those bone paintings that she made to look at the sky. It's a really kind of fascinating work that way, and she made it, or she had it made, in various sizes. So here is the 118-inch version of this. I don't know where this sculpture actually exists, but this is definitely a woman who knew how to have her photograph taken. So in the when she was in her 60s, her eyesight began to fail. And so she started sort of seeking new modes of expression. She was doing a lot of watercolor. By the time she was in her 80s, she was nearly blind, so she had macular degeneration. But these watercolors are just so gorgeous. They're such deceptively simple compositions. Her watercolors make me feel like I could do a watercolor and want to frame it and live with it, but I think I just want to live with her watercolors. They're just so beautifully rendered. There's such a great sense of when to stop. They're sparse, but they are so powerful. In addition to painting watercolors, she started making sculpture. She started making pottery. And there was a young man who entered her life and played a new starring role. And this is like the perfect bookend to the romantic scandal that started her career. So this young man's name is Juan Hamilton. He was 58 years younger than Georgia O'Keeffe. He was in his 20s, he was divorced, he was kind of looking for odd jobs. First she sent him away, she wanted nothing to do with him, and then he just hung around so long. He became her companion, and a lot of people thought maybe more than that. They definitely loved making art together. He kind of took this leadership role in guiding her through ceramics, and she would make these beautiful, sort of smooth but slightly irregular pots like we see here. Not a big surprise because Georgia O'Keeffe was the kind of woman who had a collection of favorite rocks. This is a photo of her favorite rock here. So she loved these kinds of forms. Now this is a little bit of a spoiler because Georgia O'Keeffe lived to the ripe age of 98 years old. She died in 1986. You might remember this. Her estate was worth $76 million at that point. And she had bequeathed almost all of it to that young man, Juan Hamilton. And it became quite the scandal. Some people thought maybe even they had gotten secretly married. I mean, she never acknowledged that there was anything more than a friendship there, but I think she sort of delighted in the fact that people were speculating. So she bequeathed her houses, so much to him. And he essentially instantly gave it back. He said he wanted to make his way on his wits and his work, to his credit. But it certainly started a lot of conversations about estate planning after it was revealed that she had gifted so much to him. So let's wrap up very quickly with Georgia O'Keeffe's legacy. When you live to the age of 98, you get to be honored during your lifetime, and I'm so happy that she got to experience that. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford in 1977, and then in '85, Ronald Reagan gave her the National Medal of Arts, so she's receiving really like the highest civilian awards, really. By the 1970s, when we have this wave of feminist artists and art historians, people are looking back at like the history of women producing art. This woman named Mary Beth Edelson created this collage in 1972 called "Some Living American Women Artists," and it's a send-up of Leonardo's Last Supper, and right here in the position of Jesus is Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe is sort of at the center of it all. When Judy Chicago made her famous feminist dinner party in 1979, it was finished. Everybody's got an equal place at this triangular table, but she made darn sure that Georgia O'Keeffe had a special place setting here with something that sort of looks like a three-dimensional version of her flowers, and notice the antlers or animal bones here in the letter G. In fact, Georgia O'Keeffe was so important and so cool that even Andy Warhol wanted to hang out with her. Like I said, she died in 1986 at the age of 98. These photographs were taken just a few years before that. So, I mean, she was in pretty good company towards the end of her life there. And even after she passed away, artists were still creating visual testaments to her incredible career and impact on the arts. This is a work by an artist named David P. Bradley. It's at the Denver Art Museum. But you can see he's kind of encapsulated her whole career in this charming little picture that's a nice reference to Whistler's mother too, but the sort of stark black and white clothes that she was known to wear, her rock collection, the mesas, the cross, the flowers, it's all there, right? Squeezed it all in. And 11 years after her death, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum was founded in Santa Fe. I understand that they just had a major expansion too, that it looks pretty great there. They even have a little presentation of her artist supplies, her materials there, so we can sort of get a sense in terms of how she'd feel inspired looking at that landscape and then the materials that she would actually pick up to use to create a work of art. In terms of auction sales, you might have heard about this one, that Jimson weed that we'd seen earlier, painted in 1932. It sold for a record $44 million back in 2014. Nobody had ever paid more money for a work by a woman artist before. It's now in the collection of the Crystal Bridges Museum. So 44 million sounds like a lot, right? But it's really nothing compared to how much is paid for the work of male artists. Her buddy there, Andy Warhol, his auction records are 4 times that. So it's an impressive sort of posthumous feat here, but we can see that women still have a long way to go. So we wrap up tonight thinking about this extraordinary woman who succeeded in a male-dominated industry and who was eventually able to carve out the life she desired in the desert. During her 7-decade-long career, she created so many iconic works that are still so beloved today. We'd be doing her legacy a disservice if we think of her as merely a painter of flowers. Thank you.